You're not family, Walter. You're just the account my daughter married into. Renata Cole says it in the same tone she'd used to order a coffee. Nobody in that dining room moved. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot lid rattled once against a burner and went still. Nobody coughed. Nobody reached for their wine. For 3 full seconds, the loudest sound in the house was the refrigerator compressor kicking on. And I sat there at the head of my own table and felt exactly like the old vending machine my father used to keep in the garage. The one everybody remembered only when they were hungry, and forgot the second they'd taken what they wanted. My name is Walter Grant. I'm 63 years old. For 22 years, I sat across interview tables from men and women who'd learned to lie so smoothly they believed themselves, and I got paid by a regional bank to catch every one of them. I retired 4 years ago with a good pension, a paid-off house, and the kind of quiet, boring credibility that comes from 3 decades of being right about people slowly, carefully, on paper. None of that saved me at my own dinner table. I'm not going to give you the long version of what my wife Diane and I built over 34 years of marriage. I'll give you 3 numbers, because numbers are the only part of my old job I ever trusted completely. 34 years married to the same woman. 22 years reading fraud cases for a living. $61,500. That's what Diane and I had put into our son Caleb's wedding by the time Renata Cole said what she said. At a dinner we were hosting, in a house we still owned outright because we'd never once bought anything we couldn't afford. That's the whole ledger. Everything else in this story is what happened because of it. I should tell you the part I'm not proud of first, because a man who only tells you the parts where he looks strong isn't telling you the truth. For 6 years after I left the bank, I couldn't sit in a room where someone slid a stack of papers toward me without my hands starting to shake. Just slightly, just at the knuckles, right before I signed anything. It wasn't dramatic. Diane was usually the only one who noticed. It went back to a case near the end of my career, a widow named Louise Fenmore, who'd trusted her own nephew with her retirement, and I'd caught the fraud 4 months too late to save most of it. I'd done my job. I'd built the case. I'd gotten a conviction, and it hadn't mattered, because 4 months too late means 4 months too late no matter how good the paperwork looks afterward. I never told Caleb about Louise Fenmore. I never told him why I read every contract twice, why I asked for line-item invoices when other fathers just wrote the check. He thought it was a personality quirk. He used to tease me about it. Dad, you'd audit a birthday card if it had a return address. I want you to hold on to that detail, because it matters later. Everything I did in the months that followed, the notebook, the recorder, the meeting with the state attorney's office, none of it came from anger. It came from 22 years of training myself not to trust a feeling until the paper backed it up, and from one dead case file I still keep in a drawer because I never want to forget what it costs to be 4 months too late. Caleb was 29 when he brought Vanessa Cole home. I liked her immediately, and I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story where I saw through anyone at first sight. Vanessa had an easy laugh, and she asked Diane real questions about her garden, and actually listened to the answers. She worked as a hospital dietitian, modest salary, no airs about her. If you'd asked me in the first 6 months whether I trusted my future daughter-in-law, I'd have said yes without blinking. Her mother was a different animal entirely, and it took me embarrassingly long to see it, because Renata Cole didn't announce herself the way some people do. She arrived soft. She arrived helpful. I do event coordination on the side. She told us the first time we all had dinner together, mostly for nonprofits. But I've done a few weddings. I'd love to help however I can. No charge, obviously. Just family helping family. She said it warmly, refilling Diane's wine glass like she'd lived in our kitchen for years. I remember thinking, what a relief. Someone who actually knows what she's doing. That's the sentence I'd take back if I could. What a relief. The wedding planning started the way these things do. Small, reasonable, easy to say yes to. A venue deposit here. A caterer tasting there. Renata had a guy for everything. A florist who gave family rates. A photographer who owed her a favor. A linen rental company she'd worked with a dozen times. Every vendor she brought us felt like a gift. Every invoice she handed over felt like she was saving us money, not costing us any. 6 weeks in, she suggested something that felt at the time like nothing at all. "It'll be so much simpler," she said, sliding a printed form across our kitchen table, "if we just open one shared account for wedding expenses. That way nobody's tracking 5 different Venmo threads, nobody's waiting on reimbursement, and I can pay vendors directly the second a deposit's due instead of chasing everybody down for their share." She smiled at Diane. "You two are already so generous. This just makes it easier for you, not harder." I looked at the form. Joint signatory account, 3 names, mine, Diane's, Renata's. I remember my hand doing the thing it does, the small tremor, right at the knuckles, and I remember telling myself it was just old habit, just Louise Fenmore talking, just an old man who couldn't sign anything without his body treating it like a crime scene. "Makes sense," I said, and I signed it. I want to be honest about something else. Caleb was in the room for that conversation. He didn't say anything. Not a word of caution, not a raised eyebrow, nothing. Later, months later, when everything had come apart and we were finally speaking plainly to each other, he told me he'd had a small flicker of unease even then, watching his fiancée's mother produce a bank form like she'd printed it that morning just for us, and he'd swallowed it because Vanessa Waspy and the wedding was moving forward, and he didn't want to be the man who made his mother-in-law feel unwelcome in her first month as family. I understood that impulse better than he knew. I'd swallowed a lot of things too, over the years, for the sake of a quiet table. The account started with our contribution. $40,000 transferred the week after we signed. Within a month, 11,000 of it was gone to a company called Cole and Marsh Event Consultants. Renata's own business, the very one she'd told us she ran at cost, family rate, no charge. I didn't catch it right away. That's the part that still sits wrong in my stomach when I think about it, because catching exactly this kind of thing had been my entire career, and for 2.5 months I looked at those statements the way a man looks at his own kitchen table, too familiar to actually see. What finally made me look twice wasn't suspicion. It was habit. I balance every account I've ever held to the penny, out of the same old man reflex that makes my hand shake before I sign things, and one Tuesday night in March, sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee gone cold, I pulled up 3 months of statements just to reconcile them against Renata's vendor invoices, the way I'd done 100 small audits for 100 small nonprofits back before I retired, mostly out of boredom, mostly just to keep the old muscles working. The florist invoice said $2,400. The withdrawal from our account made the same week said $4,850. I sat with that number for a long time. I told myself there were a dozen innocent explanations. Maybe there was a second payment I'd forgotten. Maybe Renata had fronted the difference and was owed reimbursement. I am a careful man, and careful men don't build a case on one number. So I did what 22 years of training told me to do. I got quiet, I got patient, and I started pulling every invoice against every withdrawal, one by one, without saying a word to anyone. Here is what I found, laid out as plainly as I can. Over 11 weeks, 9 separate withdrawals from the joint account had gone out in amounts of $9,200, $9,400, $8,900, $9,600, each one just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic bank reporting. I'd spent 2 decades of my career explaining that exact pattern to junior investigators. It has a name. It's called structuring, and the only reason anyone structures a series of withdrawals just under a reporting line is that they know the line is there and they're trying not to cross it. Ordinary people paying ordinary vendors do not accidentally withdraw $9,400 4 separate times. I didn't confront anyone that night. I want you to understand why, because it's the same reason I built a career catching people who lie for a living. The moment you show your hand too early, the person on the other side of the table has time to build a better story. I closed my laptop, I went upstairs, and I lay next to Diane in the dark for a long time before I told her anything at all. "Something's wrong with the wedding account," I finally said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How wrong?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out." I didn't sleep that night, and it wasn't fear that kept me up. It was the particular, cold clarity I used to feel the night before I walked into an interview room with a case I knew I could prove. I hadn't felt it in 4 years. I'd almost forgotten what it was like to trust my own hands again. The next morning, over coffee, I asked Caleb a question I'd been circling for a week, without letting myself land on it directly. How well do you actually know Renata's business, Colin Marsh? Who's Marsh? Caleb frowned. I don't know. I never asked. Why? No reason yet, I said, and I meant the yet. I wasn't ready to hand him a half-built case. A man who spent his whole career on evidence doesn't walk into his son's kitchen with a theory and call it proof. I needed the paper first. I needed all of it. So I did the thing I'd done for a living for 22 years. Except this time there was no bank badge, no subpoena power, no case number. There was just an old man at his kitchen table with a legal pad, a folder of bank statements, and a business registry website open on his laptop at 11 at night while his wife slept upstairs, believing, the way I had believed for 2.5 months, that the worst thing happening in our family right now was a slightly stressful wedding budget. I found Colin Marsh event consultants registered with the state 8 months earlier, right around the time Caleb had proposed. 2 officers listed, Renata Cole, and a name I didn't recognize, Deborah Marsh. I searched Deborah Marsh next, out of the same instinct that used to make me pull employment records on every business partner in a fraud case, and found a small news item from 6 years back, 3 states away, a civil judgment against a company called Marsh Premier Events for what the article called Vanner billing irregularities, totaling just under $30,000. No criminal charges, a quiet settlement. The kind of thing that doesn't follow a person unless somebody goes looking. I sat back in my chair and felt something I hadn't felt in 4 years. Not anger exactly, and not even surprise. Recognition. The specific, sinking recognition of a pattern you've seen before, wearing a new face. I want to stop here and tell you something my father told me, years before any of this, back when I was 26 years old and deciding whether to take the fraud examiner job in the first place, instead of something that paid better. My father ran a small hardware store his whole life, and he wasn't a man who talked much. But the week I told him about the job offer, he handed me his old pocket watch, the one his own father had carried, and he said, "A man who watches the small numbers never gets surprised by the big ones." I've carried that watch in my breast pocket every working day since, through every interview, every deposition, every case. I was carrying it that night too, at my kitchen table, when I finally understood what the small numbers had been trying to tell me for 11 weeks. I didn't say anything to Caleb or Vanessa yet. I wanted the whole shape of it first. Not because I doubted what I'd found, but because I'd learned the hard way, with Louise Fenmore, that showing a family half a case is sometimes worse than showing them nothing at all. Half a case gets argued with. A whole case gets believed. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known that night, sitting alone with my legal pad and my father's watch and a folder full of numbers that didn't add up, was that the woman at the center of all of it wasn't quite the architect I thought she was. I was about to spend the next several weeks building a case against Renata Cole. I had no idea yet that I'd eventually have to decide whether to use it against her daughter too, and that the answer to that question would end up mattering more than any number in my folder. The rehearsal dinner was 5 weeks away. Renata didn't know I'd started looking. Caleb didn't know either. And Vanessa, sweet, easy-lawing Vanessa, who still asked Diane real questions about her garden and still listened to the answers. Vanessa didn't know that her own mother's name was about to end up in a file folder on my desk, next to a dead case I'd never quite closed the door on, no matter how many years passed. I finished my coffee that morning, kissed Diane on the top of her head, and told Caleb I needed to run some errands. What I actually did was drive 40 minutes to the county recorder's office and pull every public filing I could find on Cole and Marsh event consultants. It was the first of many quiet mornings like that one. I didn't know yet how many more there'd be, or how much it would cost me to keep my mouth shut for as long as I did. I only knew that a man who watches the small numbers doesn't get surprised by the big ones, and I had absolutely no intention of being surprised again. I didn't tell Diane everything I'd found that week. I told her enough that the numbers didn't line up, that I was looking into it, but I kept the county filings and the Marsh judgment to myself a little longer. The way I used to sit on a half-built case at the bank until I had something you couldn't argue with. Diane knew me well enough not to push. 34 years of marriage teaches you which silences to respect. What I couldn't keep to myself was the bank lobby. I need to explain something about the years after Louise Fenmore, because it matters for what happened next. For 6 years, I hadn't set foot inside a bank branch as anything other than a customer making a simple deposit. In and out in 5 minutes, no meetings, no forms with more than one line to sign. My old branch manager, a decent man named Aaron, who'd worked 2 desks down from me for a decade, still waved at me through the glass sometimes, and I still waved back. And neither of us ever mentioned why I never came in to actually sit down anymore. I had to sit down that week. I needed the full transaction history on the joint account, printed, not just the mobile app summary, because printed statements carry routing details the app strips out, and I needed to see exactly which branch each of those 9 structured withdrawals had cleared through. I put on a collared shirt. I told Diane I was running to the bank, and she looked at me the way she looks at me when she already knows something costs me more than I'm saying, and she didn't ask. She just touched my arm on the way out the door. The same gentle but firm touch she's given me for 3 decades, whenever she wants me to know she's watching without wanting to be watching. I got as far as the lobby doors. I stood there for what felt like a long time, though later I'd realize it was probably under a minute, my hand on the cold brass handle, my chest doing the thing it used to do outside interview rooms, and behind my eyes I wasn't seeing the lobby at all. I was seeing Louise Fenmore's kitchen, 4 months too late, her hands shaking worse than mine ever had, asking me in a small voice whether there was anything left. There wasn't. Not enough to matter. I stepped back from the door. I stood on the sidewalk in a collared shirt at 9 in the morning, an old man who used to walk into rooms like this one and take apart other people's lies for a living, and for 90 seconds I could not make myself go inside a building I had walked into 10,000 times before. Aaron found me there. He'd seen me through the glass, apparently, and come out to check. "Walter," he said, "you all right?" "Fine," I said. "Just need the full history on an account. Wanted the printed statements, not the app version." He didn't push either. That's the thing about people who've known you a long time. They let you keep your dignity even when you're standing on a sidewalk failing to walk through a door. He brought the printouts out to me himself, right there on the bench outside, and sat with me while I looked through them, not saying much, just being present the way a good colleague is present, and by the time I'd found what I needed, my hands had steadied enough to hold the pages without them shaking. I'm telling you this part because I want you to understand something about generosity that took me most of my life to learn. The people who give the most freely are very often the ones who've been hurt the worst by trusting the wrong person once, and they keep giving anyway, not because they've forgotten the hurt, but because they've decided the alternative, becoming a man who trusts no one, costs more than the risk does. I wasn't a hero standing on that sidewalk. I was a scared old man doing his job anyway. There's a difference, and I think the difference matters more than the story usually admits. The printed statements confirmed everything the app had shown, and something more. Each of the 9 structured withdrawals had cleared through the same branch, 40 minutes outside the city, nowhere near our house, nowhere near the venue, nowhere near anywhere Renata had ever mentioned doing business. I wrote the branch address on my legal pad and underlined it twice. 3 days later, I drove out there, not to make a scene. I want to be clear. I never once raised my voice at a teller or asked a single question a normal customer wouldn't ask. I sat in the branch lobby, waited for a lull, and asked the manager on duty, a young woman with a kind face, whether she could tell me anything about a business account under the name Cole and Marsh. She couldn't, of course. Account privacy doesn't bend for a curious father-in-law to be, and she was right not to bend it. But she mentioned, in the offhand way people mention things when they don't realize they're mentioning anything at all, that a woman matching Renata's description had come in a lot, actually, more than most small businesses, and that she'd once overheard her on the phone in the lobby, annoyed, saying something about Deborah handling the Ashford wedding numbers. Not me. I told her to keep it under the line. I thanked her and left before she could think twice about what she'd said. In my old job, we called that kind of thing a stray thread, something a witness hands you without meaning to, that unravels a whole sweater if you pull it right. I had a name now, Deborah Marsh, and I had confirmation, secondhand but real, that someone in that partnership was actively managing withdrawals to stay under a reporting threshold on purpose, out loud, in a bank lobby. I found Deborah Marsh's number through a business licensing directory, publicly available, nothing I shouldn't have had access to, and I called her on a Thursday evening, identifying myself honestly as Walter Grant, the father of the groom in the Cole Grant wedding, currently a joint signer on the wedding account. There was a long pause on the line. Then, I wondered when someone would call. Deborah Marsh, it turned out, hadn't worked with Renata in almost 2 years. She'd been a silent partner in the original business filing, a favor to an old friend, she said, nothing more, and Renata had kept using her name on paperwork long after their actual working relationship ended. Mostly, Deborah suspected, because a second name on an LLC made the whole operation look more legitimate to nervous parents writing large checks. Deborah told me about the civil judgment from 6 years back without my having to ask. She wanted it on the record, she said, because she'd spent 2 years watching Renata's name attached to business filings she had nothing to do with, and she was tired of it. She's good at this, Deborah told me, not smart good, patient good. She finds families who trust easily, and she never takes so much at once that anyone notices. A little here, a little there, always just under the line. I told her years ago it would catch up to her eventually. I don't think she believed me. I asked her carefully whether she'd be willing to put any of this in writing if it came to that. She said yes without hesitating. I should have said something a long time ago, she told me. Consider this me finally saying it. I want to pause here and tell you about my granddaughter, because what happened 2 nights after that call reminded me why I was doing any of this in the first place, and it had nothing to do with numbers. My daughter Emily, Caleb's younger sister, brought her little girl Sophie over for dinner that Saturday, the way she does most weekends. Sophie is 6, and she has Diane's exact laugh, and she has a habit of asking questions so plainly that the whole table usually goes quiet, trying to figure out how to answer them without lying to a child. That night, Sophie was sitting on my knee while I read the mail, and she asked, apropos of nothing, Grandpa, if you give Uncle Caleb and Vanessa all your money for the wedding, will you still have enough money left for your birthday? Diane laughed. Emily told Sophie that wasn't a polite thing to ask. I didn't laugh. I sat there with my granddaughter on my knee and thought about the fact that a 6-year-old had, without meaning to, asked the exact question. I'd been too proud and too careful to ask myself in plain language for 11 weeks. Was there going to be anything left? There's always enough for your birthday, sweetheart, I told her, because it was true, and because some truths you save for children exactly as simple as they need them. But I went to bed that night, thinking about the question underneath her question, not whether I'd have money left, but whether generosity that gets taken advantage of stops being generosity at all, or whether it's still worth something even when it's abused. I still don't have a clean answer to that. I don't think there is one. The insult came 4 days later, at the final dress fitting, of all places, a small boutique with too many mirrors and not enough chairs, where Diane and I had been invited mostly, I think, so Renata would have an audience for the final decisions about flowers and seating that had somehow, despite everyone's best intentions, ended up entirely in her hands. I was wearing my father's pocket watch, as I do most days, tucked into my breast pocket on its short chain, an old habit nobody in the family had ever commented on before. Renata noticed it while we were waiting for Vanessa to come out in the dress, and she reached over, without asking, and lifted it slightly out of my pocket to look at it. Oh, this old thing, she said, letting it drop back against my chest with a small, dismissive laugh. My father collected real antiques. This looks like something off a yard sale table. She said it lightly. The way you'd comment on the weather? Already turning back toward the mirror to check her own reflection. No offense, Walter, it's sweet that you keep it. sentimental value and all that. Diane's hand found mine under the little side table between our chairs. She didn't say anything, neither did I. But I want you to understand what that watch actually was, because Renata didn't, and I never bothered to correct her. My father ran that hardware store for 41 years. He never once, in his whole life, took a vacation longer than 4 days, because he didn't trust anyone else to run the register honestly while he was gone. When he died, the watch was the only thing of real value he left me, not because it was worth much money, but because he'd worn it every single working day of his life, the same way I have, and because the last thing he ever said to me, 3 days before the stroke that took him, was, "Watch the small numbers, Walter. The big ones take care of themselves if you do." I have never once, in 37 years, let anyone touch that watch the way Renata Cole touched it that afternoon, casually, carelessly, like it was nothing, like he was nothing. I didn't say a word. I sat there with my father's watch against my chest, and I thought, not for the first time, that a woman who mocks a dead man's watch to his son's face, in front of a room full of mirrors, is a woman who has never once in her life stopped to wonder what it costs other people to give her what she wants. Caleb saw it happen. I watched him watch it happen. Watched the exact moment his jaw tightened, watched him open his mouth like he was about to say something, and watched him close it again. Glancing toward Vanessa, who was still behind the fitting room curtain and hadn't heard any of it, he said nothing. Not then. I understood why, even as it stung, a wedding 6 weeks out, a fiancée he loved, a mother-in-law he was trying to keep the peace with for his own sake as much as anyone's. But I noticed it. I filed it away, the same way I'd have filed a witness's hesitation in an old interview, and I didn't hold it against him, not exactly. I just noticed that night, driving home, Caleb called me, not Diane. "Me, Dad," he said, and his voice had a rawness I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. "I should have said something today, about the watch." "You don't have to apologize for someone else," I told him, the words coming out before I'd even decided to say them, and it struck me as I said it that I'd used almost that exact sentence with him once before, years earlier, over something so much smaller I couldn't even remember what it was. Some other slight, some other silence. It seemed we'd been having small versions of this same conversation his whole life. "I've been noticing things," he said. "At the caterer walkthrough last week, the invoice number on what Renata showed us didn't match the number on the receipt taped inside the delivery box when the deposit stuff came. I saw it. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was imagining it. I pulled the car over. I sat in the dark on the shoulder of a road I'd driven 1,000 times, and I said, 'Caleb, I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to not repeat any of this to Vanessa yet. Not because I don't trust her, but because I don't yet know what she knows and what she doesn't, and I don't want to hand her mother a warning before I'm ready.' I told him. Not everything, not Deborah Marsh's name, not the structuring pattern in full technical detail, but enough. Enough for him to understand that his father, a man who'd spent 22 years catching exactly this kind of thing, believed with real confidence that money was being taken from us on purpose, in a pattern designed specifically to avoid detection. There was a long silence on the line. Then I heard something I hadn't heard from my son in probably 15 years. A small, broken sound, not quite a sob, more like the sound a man makes when something he's been holding up alone for a long time finally gets set down. I drove the rest of the way home and found him already in our driveway when I pulled in, sitting on the tailgate of his truck in the dark, waiting. I got out of my car and walked over, and, without either of us saying anything about it, without either of us being the kind of men who do this easily, I put my arms around my son and held on. He held on back, hard, the way you hold on to something when you finally understand you're allowed to. We stood like that in the driveway for a long time. Diane came out onto the porch at some point and saw us and went back inside without a word, the way she does when she knows a moment doesn't need a witness. "What do we do?" Caleb asked, finally pulling back, wiping his face with the back of his hand like he was embarrassed about it, though I made sure not to act like I'd noticed. "We finish building the case," I told him, quietly, carefully, "and then we decide, together, what happens with Vanessa, because whatever her mother's done, I don't yet know how much of it Vanessa knows, and I am not going to let this become a reason to hurt someone who might turn out to be as much a victim of this as we are." He nodded slowly. "She's been weird lately," he said, "distracted. Distant with her mom, actually. More than with me. I thought it was wedding stress. I thought about that for a long moment, sitting there in the dark with my son." "Maybe it's not," I said. I didn't know yet how right that guess would turn out to be. I didn't know that 3 days later, Vanessa herself would knock on our door alone, without Caleb, her eyes red, holding her phone in both hands like it might go off, and that what she'd come to show us would change everything I thought I understood about who the real villain in this story actually was. Vanessa came alone on a Tuesday evening, no call ahead, standing on our porch in the same navy raincoat she'd worn the first night Caleb brought her home 14 months earlier. Diane opened the door, and I heard her voice catch. Not quite surprise. More like recognition of something she'd been half expecting for weeks without letting herself name it. "Is Caleb here?" Vanessa asked. "I need to talk to both of you. Actually, I need to talk to Walter specifically. I want to tell you honestly what went through my mind in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, and I think it would have been easy for it to be. I'd spent 6 weeks quietly building a case, and here was the daughter of the woman at the center of it, standing on my porch, looking like she hadn't slept. Some part of an old fraud examiner's instinct wanted to sit her down and let her talk without interrupting, the way you do with a witness who's about to give you more than they realize. But a bigger part of me, the part that had held my son in a dark driveway 3 nights earlier, just saw a young woman who looked frightened, and I stepped back from the door and said, "Come in, Vanessa. Sit down. Nobody's angry at you." I didn't know yet whether that last part was true. I said it anyway, because it felt like the right thing to offer before I knew. She sat at our kitchen table, the same table where her mother had said the words that started all of this, and she set her phone down in front of her, face up, screen dark, both hands flat on either side of it like she needed to hold herself steady. "I found something," she said, 2 days ago. "I wasn't looking for it, I want you to know that. I was trying to find my mom's number for the florist, and I went into her laptop to grab it from her contacts, and there was a folder. Password protected, but she'd left it logged in." Her voice was shaking now, not dramatically, just steadily, the way a voice shakes when someone is working very hard to keep it level. "It's a spreadsheet, Walter, every wedding she's ever coordinated, going back 9 years. Column after column. And there's a column labeled buffer." She turned the phone around and showed me a photograph she'd taken of the laptop screen. I didn't reach for the phone. I've learned, across 22 years of interviews, never to touch a piece of evidence before the person holding it is ready to let it go. So I waited, and after a moment she slid it across the table herself. The spreadsheet was exactly what she said. 11 weddings over 9 years. Client names down the left column, invoice totals in one column, actual vendor costs in another, and a third column, buffer, showing the difference, always kept, as far as I could tell from the rows visible in the photo, under a threshold that would draw attention. Our wedding was the 12th row. The buffer column next to our names read $16,400. "There's more," Vanessa said. "I recorded something. I wasn't trying to. I had my phone out on the counter. Voice memos open because I'd been dictating a grocery list, and I forgot to stop it before my mom came into the kitchen. She was on the phone with someone. I didn't recognize the voice at first. It was Deborah. She hadn't known the name meant anything to me yet. I didn't tell her it did. I just listened." "I'll play it," Vanessa said, and her hand was shaking now, visibly, as she found the file. "I need you to hear it from her, not from me telling you what she said. I don't want you to think I'm making any of this softer than it is." She pressed play and set the phone down between us on the table. I'm not going to reproduce every word of that recording here, because some of it isn't mine to repeat, and because a recording like that matters more in what it revealed than in its exact language. But I can tell you what it established, plainly, in Renata's own voice, talking to Deborah Marsh like she still worked with her, like 2 years of silence hadn't happened at all. She talked about keeping Walter's numbers clean on paper, so nothing would spook a man who used to do this for a living. She talked about the Grant wedding as a good one, generous, not the type to check every receipt, a sentence that landed in my chest harder than almost anything else that night, because for 11 weeks, that description had been exactly, humiliatingly true. And near the end, she said something that made Vanessa's hand come up to cover her mouth, even though she must have already heard it a dozen times before playing it for us. Vanessa doesn't need to know the details. She thinks I'm just helping. Let her think that. It's better for everyone if she stays sweet and useless about the money side. The recording ended. The kitchen was very quiet. She said that about me, Vanessa said, and I watched something break open in her face that I don't think had fully broken until that exact moment, hearing her own mother's voice describe her, to her face, as sweet and useless. My whole life, she's told me I'm not good with money, that I should just let her handle things, that I'm too trusting. I believed her. I actually believed her about myself. I sat with that for a moment before I spoke, because I wanted to get this part right. Vanessa, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, because a lot depends on it. Did you know, at any point before 2 days ago, that your mother was taking money from this wedding fund beyond what she was owed? She looked at me directly, and there wasn't a flicker of anything in her face except exhaustion and grief. No, she said. I swear to you, no. I thought she was doing this for free, out of love, the way she always told everyone. I've spent my whole life thinking my mother was generous with her time because she loved me. I don't know what to think now. I believed her. Not because I wanted to. 22 years of training taught me not to trust wanting to believe, but because everything in her voice, her posture, the way she'd walked into this exact kitchen, carrying the evidence against her own mother instead of hiding it, matched every marker I'd ever learned to look for in someone telling the truth under real cost to themselves. A guilty person protects the evidence. Vanessa had driven straight to the house of the man she knew on some level was already building a case and handed it to him herself. Thank you, I told her, for bringing this to us instead of burying it. She started crying then, quietly, the kind of crying that's less about the immediate moment and more about years of something finally coming loose. Diane got up and put an arm around her, and I watched my wife hold a young woman we'd known for barely over a year the same steady way she'd held Caleb through every hard thing in his own life, and I thought, whatever else is true about this family right now, that instinct in Diane hasn't changed and it isn't going anywhere. I want to be careful here about what I did next, because it matters, and because I've learned the hard way that the difference between justice and cruelty often comes down to exactly this kind of careful choice. I did not, that night, call the police. I did not confront Renata. I did not even tell Vanessa everything I already knew, about Deborah Marsh's willingness to testify, about the structured withdrawals, about the branch 40 minutes outside the city. Instead, I asked her a single question. What do you want to happen? She looked genuinely startled by the question, like it hadn't occurred to her that she'd have a say. I don't know, she said. I want my wedding to still happen. I want my mother to stop hurting people. I don't know how to want both of those things at once. You don't have to know yet, I told her. But I think you should know that you're not the only one who's been building a case. And I think before this goes any further, the two of us should sit down properly, with Caleb, with Diane, and with an attorney I trust, and figure out how to handle this in a way that protects you and Caleb both, and holds your mother responsible without turning your wedding into a public spectacle neither of you asked for. She nodded, wiping her face. I don't want it to be a spectacle, she said. I want it to be true. That's different. I've thought about that sentence a lot since. I want it to be true. That's different. I think that's the most honest thing anyone said to me during the entire 6 weeks that followed, and it came from the daughter of the woman I'd spent those 6 weeks quietly investigating. Caleb came home 20 minutes later. I'd texted him the moment Vanessa arrived, and I watched him walk into that kitchen and see his fiancée sitting at our table with her mascara ruined, and her mother's laptop photographed on her phone, and I watched him not hesitate for even a second. He crossed the room and knelt down next to her chair and put both his hands over hers on the table, and he didn't say anything about her mother. and he didn't ask her to explain herself, and he didn't do any of the things a lesser man might have done in that moment out of shock or embarrassment. He just said, "I've got you. Whatever happens next, I've got you." And I thought, watching my son in that moment, that whatever mistakes I might have made raising him, and I know now that I made some, which I'll tell you about later, I had at least managed to raise a man who knew how to show up. We called my attorney the next morning, a careful, unhurried woman named Priya Anand, who'd handled small estate matters for me for over a decade, and who I trusted completely to keep this contained and correct. I laid out everything I had: the structured withdrawals, the branch confirmation, Deborah Marsh's willingness to speak on record, and now Vanessa's spreadsheet and recording, offered voluntarily, not obtained by anyone snooping through anything that wasn't already handed to them freely. Priya was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Walter," she said, "this is a strong civil case, and depending on what the state attorney's Consumer Protection Division decides once we send them the pattern evidence, it may end up being more than civil. But I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. You are not going to march into a rehearsal dinner and read numbers off a spreadsheet in front of 200 guests. That's not how we're going to do this. If we're going to use anything at the wedding itself, and I understand the instinct, believe me, I've seen families want exactly that. It has to be something that's already been verified as legally sound to disclose. Not raw account numbers, not accusations, something clean. What would you suggest?" I asked. "Confront her privately first," Priya said. "Give her the chance to respond, to explain herself, to fall apart in front of her own daughter rather than in front of 200 strangers. If she confirms what the evidence already shows, and people like this, Walter, in my experience, when they're finally cornered with real proof, they very often do confirm it, because the alternative feels worse to them than the truth does. Then we talk about restitution, about a formal agreement, about whether any of this needs to go further than your family. The recording and the spreadsheet aren't there to humiliate anyone at a public ceremony. They're there so that when you sit her down privately, she knows there's no version of this where she talks her way out." I sat with that advice for a long moment, my father's watch a small warm weight against my chest, and I thought about Louise Fenmore again, the way I still thought about her more often than I let anyone know. I thought about how much I would have given, at the end of that old case, for someone to have caught her nephew before the money was gone, instead of after. Quietly, privately, with enough proof that there was nowhere left for him to run, instead of publicly, dramatically, after the damage was already permanent. "All right," I said. "We do it your way." The rehearsal dinner was 11 days away. I had 11 days to finish building a case airtight enough that a woman who had spent 9 years perfecting the art of staying just under the line would have absolutely nowhere left to go once we sat her down. I had 11 days, and a granddaughter's innocent question still sitting somewhere in my chest, and a son who'd finally started telling me the truth instead of swallowing it, and a soon-to-be daughter-in-law who'd walked into my kitchen and handed me the exact evidence I needed instead of burying it to protect her own mother. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew yet, sitting around that kitchen table making our careful, quiet plan, was that Renata Cole was about to make one more move of her own, and that it would force everything we'd planned to happen 11 days sooner than any of us were ready for. 3 days before the rehearsal dinner, Priya called me at 7 in the morning, which told me before she said a word that something had moved faster than we'd planned. "The bank flagged a withdrawal attempt yesterday afternoon," she said. $41,000 requested against the joint account, denied automatically, because it exceeded the remaining structured threshold pattern. Their fraud system had already started tracking after your report to the State Consumer Division last week. Renata tried to pull almost everything that was left. Walter, in one move, I think she knows something's coming. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone against my ear and felt the old, cold clarity settle back over me, the same feeling I used to get the morning of an interview I already knew I'd win. "Then we don't wait for the rehearsal dinner," I said. "We do this today. We did it at our house, not hers, not a restaurant. not anywhere with an audience beyond the five of us who needed to be in that room: me, Diane, Caleb, Vanessa, and Renata, who arrived at 4 that afternoon expecting, I think, a conversation about seating charts, and found instead her daughter's face already wet with tears, and a manila folder sitting closed on my kitchen table. I let Priya's advice guide the shape of it. I didn't open with the spreadsheet. I opened with a question. Renata, I said, I want to give you a chance to tell us, in your own words, what's been happening with the wedding account. She looked around the table, at Vanessa, who wouldn't meet her eyes, at Caleb, whose jaw was set in a way I recognized because it was mine, and something in her face shifted, calculating, the way I imagine it always shifted in the moment, right before she decided which version of the truth to offer a room. I don't know what you think you know, she said, but I have managed every one of my clients' budgets honestly for 9 years, and I resent. Deborah Marsh, I said, and watched the calculation behind her eyes stall out completely. 9 weddings, Renata. 11 if we count the 2 before Deborah's name was even on the paperwork, a buffer column. I have a photograph of your own spreadsheet. I have a recording of your own voice explaining to Deborah how you'd keep my numbers clean because I used to do this for a living and wouldn't check too closely. I have bank confirmation of 9 structured withdrawals designed specifically to stay under a $10,000 reporting line, and I have a state consumer protection division that opened a formal inquiry 6 days ago because Deborah Marsh finally told the truth she's apparently been sitting on for 2 years. The silence that followed was different from the one at the dinner table weeks earlier. That first silence had been the whole room recoiling from a cruelty. This one was just Renata, alone, running out of road. She tried one more turn anyway. She always would, I think it was simply how she was built. You have no idea what it's like, she said, and her voice cracked in a way that sounded, for the first time since I'd known her, completely unrehearsed. To spend your whole life being generous, being helpful, and having people look at you like you're something to be managed. You people worship your dead like they matter more than the living. That stupid watch, your dead cases, your dead widow you still can't let go of. Grief doesn't pay caterers. Walter, somebody had to be practical while everyone else got to be sentimental. I felt that land, and I let it land, because I've learned that a man who defends his grief out loud to someone actively insulting it has already lost the room. I just looked at her and said quietly, You don't get to use my dead to excuse what you did to my living family. It was Vanessa who broke first, not Renata. Mom, she said, her voice raw, is Gordon in debt again? Something in Renata's face collapsed entirely at that name, and what came out over the next several minutes wasn't a confession so much as a dam finally giving way. Gordon, her partner of the last 2 years, a man none of us had ever met more than twice, had gambling debts that had gone from manageable to desperate over the past 18 months, and Renata, who had apparently skimmed modest, almost defensible amounts off wedding budgets for years as a kind of quiet insurance policy against her own precarious finances, had escalated sharply once Gordon started asking her for money she didn't have. Our wedding wasn't the first she'd taken from. It was, by her own admission, the largest. I was going to pay it back, she said, and I believed that she believed it. The way people often believe the last lie they tell themselves before the truth arrives anyway. I always meant to pay it back. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it's the part of this story people expect me to skip past on the way to the satisfying part. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired and sad in a complicated way I hadn't expected. Sad for Vanessa, watching her mother's whole carefully constructed identity come apart in real time. Sad even in some smaller corner of myself for a woman who'd apparently spent years managing her own fear the only way she knew how, badly, at other people's expense. That didn't mean there wasn't a price to pay. Prika had drawn up exactly what she'd described. Not a document where Renata renounced some inheritance she'd never had a legal claim to in the first place, but a formal restitution agreement, acknowledging the amounts owed with a repayment schedule secured against her business assets, alongside a signed waiver stating she understood the family's right to pursue the matter further through the state's ongoing inquiry and would not contest any findings that resulted from it. Renata signed both, at our kitchen table, her hand nowhere near as steady as mine had ever been. What happens to the wedding? Vanessa asked, once the papers were signed and the room had gone quiet again in a different way, exhausted rather than tense. I looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Vanessa, and I understood, watching my son's face in that moment, that whatever verdict this family reached about Renata, it wasn't going to determine whether these two young people got married. That decision belonged entirely to them, and I was glad, in a way I hadn't expected to be, that it did. The wedding happens, Caleb said, just not with your mother running the numbers. And, Dad, he looked at me, I want you walking me down that aisle metaphorically, or whatever the father of the groom version of that is, because you're the only person in this entire process who actually protected us. I need to tell you about a mistake of my own now, because I promised you at the start of this that I wasn't going to hand you a version of myself with no flaws in it, and this is the flaw that mattered most. 2 nights before the wedding, Caleb and I sat on the back porch, the way we used to when he was a teenager working through some problem too big for him to name out loud, and he asked me, gently, why I'd never told him about Louise Fenmore. Why I'd let him grow up thinking my carefulness with money was just a personality quirk instead of the scar it actually was. I sat with that question longer than I probably needed to before I answered it. Because I decided a long time ago, I finally said that the way to protect you from my fear was to never let you see it. I thought that was strength. I think now it might have just been me keeping the peace with my own past, the same way you kept the peace with Renata at that dress fitting. Telling myself, silence was kindness when really it was just easier. If I'd told you why I check every receipt twice, maybe you'd have felt safer telling me about that mismatched invoice the first week you noticed it, instead of sitting on it until it ate at you. Caleb didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, I think we both learned to swallow things from watching each other do it. Then let's stop, I said, both of us. I want to tell you about the wedding itself, because after everything it deserves better than a footnote. It was smaller than originally planned, down from 280 guests to just under 100, most of the trimmed list having been Renata's professional contacts and social obligations rather than anyone who actually loved these two young people. Vanessa planned the rest of it herself, in 6 weeks, with Diane's help and a caterer Deborah Marsh recommended personally, a small gesture of goodwill from a woman who'd finally stopped staying quiet about what she knew. I stood at the edge of the reception that evening, my father watch in my breast pocket, where it had sat every day of my working life, and I watched something happen that I hadn't planned and couldn't have arranged if I'd tried. A dozen people I hadn't invited began arriving near the end of the ceremony. Aaron from the bank, who'd sat with me on that sidewalk bench. A widow named Marguerite, whose small estate dispute I'd helped untangle for free 3 years back. Refusing every offer of payment, 2 former colleagues from the fraud division I hadn't spoken to in years. Nobody had organized it. Diane told me later that word had simply moved, quietly, the way it does among people who remember exactly what someone did for them once and never forgot it. They didn't make speeches, they didn't make a scene, they just stood near the back during the toasts, present, and it was somehow louder than anything anyone could have said out loud. Caleb gave the father of the groom toast himself, which isn't traditional. But nothing about that wedding had been traditional by then. He stood up, glass in hand, and looked at me across the room. My whole life, he said, I thought my father's carefulness was just who he was, a little strange, a little slow to trust, always checking things twice. I found out a few months ago that it came from somewhere, from a case he couldn't fix in time, from a widow he still thinks about, from a lesson his own father gave him with a pocket watch he's worn every single day since. I used to think being careful and being generous were opposites. My father spent this whole ordeal proving they're actually the same thing, done by the same person, at the same time, for the people he loves. Dad, I used to think you were quiet because you didn't have much to say. I know now you were quiet because you were carrying more than any of us realized, and you carried it so we wouldn't have to. I'm done letting you carry it alone. I'm not an emotional man in front of crowds. I want that on the record. But I stood there with a room full of people who'd shown up unasked, and my son's voice cracking slightly on the word alone, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight, I think, since a kitchen table 20 years before Louise Fenmore's name ever entered my life. Diane found me an hour later, near the edge of the dance floor, and pressed something small and worn into my hand. A card, its ink faded slightly, dated a full decade back. I found this going through the old desk drawer, looking for the marriage certificate for the toast, she said. I wrote it the year Caleb graduated. I never gave it to you. I don't know why. I think I was embarrassed by how much I meant it. I opened it there, at the edge of my son's wedding, and read my wife's handwriting from 10 years earlier. Walter, I worry sometimes that our children will grow up thinking love is just doing whatever someone asks of you. I hope, whatever happens, we teach them that love can say no and still be love. I'll always be glad I married a man who knows the difference. I read it twice. It wasn't a prophecy. It hadn't predicted Renata or the spreadsheet or the watch or any of it. It was just a woman worrying, years in advance, about the exact kind of failure I'd been afraid of my whole life without ever finding the words for it. That generosity, unchecked, curdles into something that gets used against the people who give it. I folded the card carefully and put it in my breast pocket next to my father's watch. 2 old warnings from 2 people who loved me, finally sitting together where I could feel them both. Renata didn't attend the wedding. Nobody asked her to, and to her credit, she didn't push. She's still working through the restitution schedule. Priya drew up, month by month, and Vanessa speaks to her occasionally, carefully, the way you speak to someone you're still deciding how much room to leave in your life for. I don't know how that story ends. I've made my peace with not knowing. Gordon, as far as I understand it, is no longer in the picture. His debts, apparently, finally caught up with him in ways that had nothing to do with our family at all, which felt less like justice than like the ordinary, indifferent way the world sometimes settles its own accounts without anyone's help. It's been 7 months since that dinner table conversation where a woman I trusted called me nothing but an account. Caleb and Vanessa are still married, still happy, in the particular hard-won way of 2 people who watched something ugly happen and chose each other anyway, with clearer eyes than they started with. Sophie still asks questions nobody quite knows how to answer, and last month, out of nowhere, she asked me why I always carry that old watch, and I told her the truth this time. The whole of it, the way I never told her uncle until it nearly cost us everything. I still catch myself, some mornings, running my thumb along the edge of that watch case before I put on my shirt, and I think about the difference between the man who stood frozen outside a bank lobby for 90 seconds and the man who sat at his own kitchen table months later and looked a woman dead in the eye while she tried to use his grief as a weapon against him. I don't think I became a different man in between those 2 moments. I think I finally stopped being quiet about the man I already was. Some people spend their whole lives being useful to others without ever once being seen by them, treated like a machine that dispenses what's needed and gets forgotten the moment the need is filled. But I understand now that the difference between being used and being loved was never about how much I gave. It was about whether anyone in the room was willing to actually look at what giving had cost me, and whether I was finally willing to let them. I'm not an account anymore. I never should have let anyone make me feel like one in the first place. My son knows now why I check things twice. My granddaughter knows there's always enough left over for the things that matter, and my wife's 10-year-old worry sits folded in my breast pocket next to my father's watch. 2 small warnings from 2 people who loved me enough to worry in advance. Proof, I think, that the people who watch the small numbers closely are very often the same people watching over everyone else, quietly, the whole time, whether anyone ever notices or not. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one.